Last week we started a series on the book of Esther, and it's a two-part series. And today I want to talk about something that is hard, because we all deal with it, but we don't like to deal with it. It's when we go through tremendous hardship and pain. How many of you have ever experienced that before? I mean, I'm talking the kind of hardship and pain where you just feel defeated. You feel like just curling up in a ball and just weeping because just of the circumstances that are going on around you. You feel like your hope has vanished. You just feel like the world is crashing in around you. How many of you have ever felt that way? When we go through those times, it's natural for us to do what I just described, curl up in a ball and weep. I mean, maybe you don't exactly do that, but the idea of kind of that victim mentality, you know, I've been attacked, I've been hurt, whatever, and we just kind of we just feel those feelings of victimhood, right? How many of you have ever done that? You just feel overwhelmed, feel like that victim. Well, that's a natural thing, right? It's natural for us to feel that way. It's natural for us to respond in that way. But at a certain point, we have to move on from that victim mentality. Because if we don't, it begins to destroy us and destroy our relationships. We can't continue to be the victim. We have to move on from there. Here are some symptoms of the victim mindset taking root. Being critical of others, including God. Being full of excuses. As long as you have excuses, you're going to remain a victim, right? Blaming other people, even God. You're blaming everybody else for what's happened. You're even blaming God for what's happened. A sense of hopelessness, feeling trapped, self-pity, just that Eeyore feeling, right? Everybody know Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? Everything was dark and dire, and everything was going to fail, and it was horrible, right? We have that mentality, like just nothing is positive. That deep feeling that others don't like or respect you. This mindset, when it takes root in your life, it can destroy so much of your life. First of all, it can destroy your relationship with God. Because when you have that mentality, that victim mindset, you are blaming God for your problems, right? Ultimately, He is responsible, right? You may not consciously blame God, but you are subconsciously blaming Him. Because ultimately He's in charge. Either He didn't do something or He caused this. Either He didn't stop it or He caused it, right? And so when you have this victim mentality, it begins to destroy your relationship with God. It begins to destroy your relationship with other people. Because let's be honest, nobody wants to be around someone who's full of self-pity, right? After a while, it grates on you, and you just begin to kind of distance yourself from that person because you're like, I can't handle this anymore. They're just constantly just wallowing in self-pity. It can affect your job. It's hard to perform well when you're feeling discouraged and hopeless, right? It's hard to do your job the way you're meant to do it. So at some point, you and I, when we go through hardship and pain, we have to move on from that victim mindset. And I want to challenge you today, because not only do we need to move on from that, I challenge you today that as Christians, not only do we need to move on from that victim mindset, but we need to adopt the mindset of a victor. A victor over our circumstances. But how do you do that? Well, it's all about attitude and perspective. You see, we need to change our perspective of ourselves. We need to stop looking at ourselves as helpless and hopeless. We need to change our attitude. Attitude is how we respond to our circumstances. We need to look at our circumstances and say, listen, I will not be defeated by what I'm facing. With God's help, I will overcome. You see, that's the difference between a victim and a victor. You see, a victim is all about poor me, weeping, wailing. A victor says, I will overcome. I will not be defeated. I want to show you an example from the book of Esther of what moving from being a victim to a victor looks like. And I'm going to just recap the story with you. I shared this with you last week. Esther, who is a Jewish woman, a young Jewish girl, becomes queen of all Persia, right? Esther's cousin Mordecai, who raised her, works in the palace. Now, Esther and Mordecai are both Jewish, and what happens is the king promotes his best bud, Haman, right? He just says, hey, Haman, you're the man. I'm going to put you up there just, maybe just a step below me. In fact, I'm going to make a decree that everybody has to bow down and worship you as a god. Just like they're supposed to do for me, they've got to do that for you as well. Okay? Because we're buds, and I like you, and that's just how I'm going to make it happen. Okay? And so that's what the king does. He makes this law and says, hey, everybody has to do this for Haman. Well, as I said last week, the Jews have a law that God laid out that says you are to only bow down and worship the God of heaven. So when Haman passes by, everybody's bowing and worshiping him except Mordecai. Mordecai stands and does not bow. This enrages Haman, right? He's really mad. Why is he not bowing to me? Why is he not worshiping me? But rather than take his anger out on Mordecai alone, he decides he's going to wipe out all the Jewish people in the land of Persia. So he convinces the king to write a law that makes it okay for people to attack the Jews on a certain day, to attack the Jews and kill them. And not only that, but when they do, whoever kills that Jewish person gets to take all their property. So you can just imagine if a Jewish person had a great house, great car, big screen TV, these guys would come in, they'd be like, hey, I want that. So they wipe them out and then bingo, they get it, right? It's all theirs. So the king makes this law, he signs it and he puts out all of his writers and he nails it on the walls and says, this is what's going to happen on this particular day. It's open season on Jewish people. Now, when Mordecai hears this, what has happened, what this law that's been put into effect, I want you to see how he reacts. Listen to this. In Esther chapter 4, verse 1 through 3, it says this: when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. Mordecai felt beat up. He felt defeated. Here he was doing the right thing, and then this happened. You can just imagine that he was wrestling with those feelings of, why, God? Why did you let this happen? Here I was doing the right thing. I didn't bow and worship this guy, just like you said. And now this. Now your people are going to be killed. He could have given up in defeat and just cried in self-pity. But Mordecai does something else. Mordecai decides to turn to God for help. In fact, he, Esther, and all the Jews, they take 3 days and they fast and they pray, asking God to turn this situation around. You know, when life hits us hard, we can always turn to God. He is always there for us. Listen to this verse. I love this verse. It's in Psalm 55, verse 22, and it says this: "Cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous fall." Wow. That's a powerful verse right there that we can stand on. That God is with us. He will sustain us. He will never let us fall. We can count on Him. No matter what we go through, God is with us. He wants to help us. All we have to do is ask. So that's what Esther, that's what Mordecai, that's what all the Jewish people did. They fasted and they prayed for 3 days. But I want you to see something. I'm going to show this to you in Scripture. There was a shift that happened. They were mourning, they were weeping, they were wailing, they were wearing that burlap and ashes. They were pouring ashes all over them. That must have been uncomfortable, right? Talk about the victim mentality. I mean, they were just, oh, poor us, right? For 3 days. But then after the 3 days, a shift happened. And I want you to see this. They stopped playing the victim. And they started to act like victors. Listen to this. Esther chapter 5, verse 9 through 14. We're going to jump ahead. Basically what's happened is Haman, he got this law passed. He got the king to pass this law. He's all excited. He just got invited to a banquet with the king and queen, so he's just like living on easy street, right? He's like, everything's going my way. And he just leaves the banquet and this happens. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. I want you to notice something. I want you to notice in that verse that it says that Mordecai was sitting at the palace gate. Now, if you remember back, the first passage that we read in Esther chapter 4, verse 2, it says that no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. You see, at some point after this 3 days, Mordecai got up from being the victim and said, I'm no longer going to act that way. I've turned this over to God. We will be victorious. Somehow God is going to take care of me. He is going to fight for me. I don't have to weep and wail anymore. God is with me. You see, once you put your trust in God, there's no more need to act like the victim. Because when God's on your side, you are a victor. There's nothing that God can't do. So trust His plan. Trust Him. Listen, if you're going to pray and you're going to ask God to do something on your behalf, then believe He's going to do it. But if you're not going to believe, then don't pray. Because continuing to act like a victim and that everything is hopeless reflects a lack of faith in God. When you pray and you say, God, I need you to do this, and you and you ask Him for that, when you continue to act like everything is hopeless and you're the victim, you're saying, God, I don't really trust you. I don't trust that you're going to take care of this. I love what happens when Haman meets Mordecai after the banquet. I love it because you know, a victim is someone who is just overwhelmed. right? They're overwhelmed by circumstances. They can't handle any more problems. I mean, you've probably been there. You're just like, one more problem and I'm going to break, right? I'm going to be crushed. They're hopeless. They're discouraged. They're at the end of their rope. That's the victim mentality. But Mordecai didn't face Haman like a victim. He faced him like a victor. He was strong, not weak. He was confident. He was someone who had hope. In fact, it blew Haman away. See, he thought he was going to face a victim. He was excited to see Mordecai because he figured Mordecai was going to grovel at his feet. You can just imagine that Mordecai would rush to him and bow at his feet and say, I take it all back. I'll worship you. Just stop this law from being passed, from taking effect. Have mercy, Haman. I give up. You see, that's what Haman expected, but that's not what he got. He got Mordecai, the victor. Mordecai's confidence, though, wasn't in himself, it was in God. You see, Mordecai knew that God is bigger than any problem he could ever face. And he knew that God loved his people. And he promised to take care of them. He promised to fight for them. Mordecai knew he wasn't alone. He didn't have to be afraid. God was with him. You see, Mordecai stood on promises that God had made in the past. And I want to just say this to you right now. If you're facing something, or if you do end up facing something that is difficult, like this hardship, pain, like what we're talking about in this message, you need to stand on what you know about God. Who you know God to be. And especially, you need to stand on the promises that God has given in His Word. Let me share with you two promises that will help anyone in any situation that they're going through, any hardship or pain. Listen to this promise made in Hebrews 13:5. It says this, for God has said, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. That promise is so profound. It says that no matter what we go through, God is with us. He never leaves us. He never abandons us. He never jumps ship and says, I'm done. I'm done. I can't handle this anymore. You're on your own. He never does that. And He never fails us. That's something we can stand on. Here's another truth, another promise that we can stand on. That is that God loves us and will never let us be defeated. God may, even when it seems like we have been defeated, God is getting ready to turn that situation into a major victory. We see that over and over again in Scripture. But let me show you a scripture that backs this up. It says this in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And it says this, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. That means God takes every circumstance, the good, the bad, all of it, and weaves it together and brings good out of it for you and for me. That's a promise that we can stand on. That means if we're going through something, no matter how crushing it may be, God has a plan and a purpose for it. And He's going to bring good out of it. We will never be defeated. It may seem like we're defeated, but God's just setting the stage for a major victory. There's nothing we face in life that can defeat us when God is on our side. I want to continue this story of Esther and Mordecai. And I want you to see from this story what I'm talking about. How God fights for His people. In Esther chapter 5, verse 9 through 14, it says this: Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. Haman represents the enemy of God's people. Maybe your enemy is your circumstances. But we all face an enemy that has plans for us. Plans to make us fail. Plans to attack and to hurt us. But watch what God does. In Esther chapter 6, 1 through 13, it says this: That night the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. The king had trouble sleeping. Even though it doesn't say that God caused the king to not be able to sleep, we can infer that that's what happened. God wouldn't let him sleep. He wanted to get his attention. He was preparing something. It goes on in verse 2. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. The attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. Now here's the irony. Haman is coming to ask the king to impale Mordecai on a spike. But the king has a whole nother idea. And it's all because God has plans to protect his people. Listen to this. So Haman came in and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? Talk about pride, right? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Can you just see where this is going? Can you just see how this is not going to work out the way Haman thinks it's going to work out? Because that's what God does. He frustrates the plans of the enemy. He turns it around on him and uses it to bless his people. Watch. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Great idea. I love it. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. You can just imagine Haman's jaw going. I would imagine he was probably scared for his life too. Because if the king had gotten word that he was planning to ask about impaling Mordecai, and here he wants Haman to just honor Mordecai like this, he was probably scared. And rightfully so. But his jaw just probably hit the floor. What are you talking about right now? But then it goes on, it says, so Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Talk about humiliating. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. I can imagine. Because everybody knew about Mordecai. Everybody knew he wasn't bowing like he was supposed to. You see, God turned the tables on Haman. God will never be defeated by the enemy. No matter what the enemy has planned for you or for me, God will never let us be defeated. If we trust God and continue to be obedient, God will never let the enemy defeat us. He will never let our circumstances defeat us. Even when it seems like we are defeated, again, God is just setting the stage for a major victory. Remember at the beginning of this message, Mordecai was weeping and wailing. He was a victim. And yet, a few short days later, he's riding the king's horse, and the king's own man is screaming how he wants to honor. This is how the king honors someone he is pleased with. You see, God will never let his people be defeated. When life hits us hard, we can either be the victim of our circumstances or we can be a victor over our circumstances. But you and I, we choose that. You have to choose. Like I said in the beginning, it's natural, it's normal to start out in that victim mindset. I don't even know that we can totally control that because we're just overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, this happened or that happened. That's okay. But at a certain point, we have to move on from that. We have to stop the weeping and the wailing, and we need to rise up and say, God, I know that I will be an overcomer because you're with me. Nothing will defeat me when you're with me, God. We can't give up in the face of adversity. We need to turn to God for help and then stand firm. Just like Mordecai, when he stood and faced Haman. He didn't tremble. He wasn't afraid. He put his confidence in God and say, I am an overcomer. I will not be defeated because God is with me. I don't know what you're dealing with today. Maybe you feel overwhelmed. Maybe you're facing a situation like they were facing where you just feel like everything's coming down on you. I hope you don't feel like I'm being insensitive when I say you need to, at some point, move on from that victim mentality. Because when God is on your side, you are an overcomer. You are an overcomer. And there's no reason for you to continue to feel like a victim or to act like a victim.